About 2.5 years ago, Jeff and I embarked upon a project to make a compilation of developing country choice experiment studies that were completed or were ongoing or were in the pipeline. Our assumption was that, similarly to the developed country context, which Jeff has just mentioned, in developing countries as well, this method can be useful in informing sustainable, efficient, effective policies and projects, especially those pertaining to agriculture, environment, and food. So through our networks of colleagues and friends who have been using this method in the past decade or so, we found out that several research projects that were being implemented in developing countries were already using this method in their toolkits. At the same time, several graduate students and researchers from developing countries were contacting choice experiment practitioners, seasoned choice experiment practitioners, to seek for advice as how to implement this method. So Jeff and I took advantage of this demand and then small but growing number of choice experiment studies that were being implemented in developing countries, and created this volume, which showcases not only the versatility of the method in its applications in informing the agricultural, environmental, and food policy, but also we wanted to highlight what are the specific methodological and practical issues that we think should be taken into consideration when applying this method in developing country context. So we compiled 15 selected case studies from 12 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia. They were written by 40 contributors in total. And the choice experiment applications were on a wide array of issues informing policies and projects or decision-makings of different scale. For example, 2 of the case studies are on China's sloping land conservation program, which, as you know, is one of the biggest environmental programs in the world. So one of these case studies looked at the urban public's preferences for different attributes or components of this program, and the other one looked at the rural stakeholders, farmers' preferences for different attributes of this program, for example, area of forest coverage, the water quality. By looking at different stakeholders' valuation, we think that the benefit estimates that come from these studies could help Chinese government with the development of the second phase of this program. Another set of studies looked at valuation of unique ecosystems, such as wetlands in Pakistan or forests in Chile. The aim of this was to understand whether the public in developing countries do actually value biodiversity or non-market values. Do they have non-use values for products that they do not use every day, such as biodiversity? And these studies found that, similarly to the choice experiment studies implemented in developed country context, developing country public also value biodiversity and unique ecosystems. So these benefits that accrue to these people from conservation of these ecosystems or biodiversity riches should be taken into consideration when designing long-term conservation programs. Another group of studies that were also included in the book looked at provision of public or private goods, and what do the users of these goods demand, what attributes they demand. For example, one study conducted in Ethiopia looked at farmers' trade-offs between local public goods, such as water, spring, or health center, versus extension packages, such as would they prefer inputs, such as modern inputs, such as seeds or fertilizers. So if the policymakers know what it is that those end users want, they can design more targeted interventions, whether it's public goods or private goods. Finally, in the agriculture and food context, this one example of application of this method is application in Kenya to understand livestock traders' preferences for cattle traits. Traders were interviewed to see how they trade off different traits of cattle, for example, body weight versus breed, versus condition of their body condition. By knowing what it is that the end users would want, crop breeding programs or livestock breeding programs can be informed much better, so that when they release the high-performing varieties, their adoption by farmers who are using them could be maximized. Because we couldn't invite all our contributors to this event, we asked some of them to send their footage to tell us a bit about their choice experiment studies. So I'll play that video now.
My name is Birol, talking about a study we conducted in Uganda in 2007. The title of the study was Rural Consumer Preference for Banana Attributes in Uganda. Is there a market for GM staples?
Hello, I am Sukanya Das and I am from India. I had applied the choice experiment management technique in the field of solid waste in respect of my study. Currently, I am faculty in Madras School of Economics, Chennai, India. Now, so far as my case study is concerned, we are trying to estimate the local residents' preferences for an improvement in the existing solid waste management practices which are there in two municipalities in Greater Kolkata, namely Chandanagar and South Damdam. More specifically, the aim of my study was to generate information so as to design an efficient and effective solid waste management services in these two municipalities.
Hello, my name is Birol. I'm working for the Research Institute of Ministry of Environment in Vietnam. Today, I would like to share with you some of my experience in using choice modeling to estimate wetland values in Vietnam. As you know, wetlands account for 90% of the land area in Mekong Delta in Vietnam. Although the wetlands have various values, they have been degraded due to the poor planning practice, especially lack of information on non-use values of the wetland. So, in this research, we would like to provide the policymakers with some information on the non-use values of the wetlands, so that the decision made will take into account the important component of the wetland values, that is the non-use values, the biodiversity use values of wetlands.
My case study was on valuing coastal water quality improvements on the island of Tobago, which is located in the Caribbean region. The main research problem which motivated this study came from the pollution of the coastal waters around the island. And this is as a result of an increase in nutrient pollution that's been taking place over a number of years. Now, tourism is the main economic driver in Tobago, and marine recreational activities are very important for locals as well as tourists.
So these were some of the examples of the applications of the choice experiment method in developing countries. At this point, an implicit question is, why use this method as opposed to any other method that might be generating similar kinds of information? The main advantage of this method, as Jeff has mentioned, is its ability to capture the marginal value, that's the marginal economic cost or economic benefits of improvements in several attributes or components that make up a new product or policy or a project. By knowing which attributes and components are valued by which segments of the population, it's possible to design interventions or policies or projects that are more targeted and that generate the overall highest benefits. Vis-a-vis the contingent valuation method, which is another stated preference method, the family of methods that the choice experiment method comes from. This method, the contingent valuation method, can estimate the value of a change from one state to the other, but cannot estimate the value of the components of the change, as I've just mentioned. And another advantage of this choice experiment method over contingent valuation method is the choice experiment method can minimize several of the biases that can be found in contingent valuation methods. For example, the yes-saying bias, when one asks, are you willing to say this much, yes or no? A lot of people might just say yes without thinking about it, where such issues are avoided in the choice experiment context because the respondents are presented with the goods already well defined with the prices therein. The advantage of this method vis-a-vis revealed preference methods, such as hedonic pricing method or the travel cost method, is that the revealed preference methods rely on surrogate markets in which the non-market good might be implicitly traded. For example, hedonic pricing method looks at housing markets or housing prices to estimate the value of air quality. Whereas choice experiments can be used to value non-market goods that are not marketed in any surrogate markets, or goods that are not just marketed, they're not released in the market, or not just yet, policy is not just implemented. And finally, its advantage vis-a-vis randomized experiments is that not all interventions can be randomized. For example, China's sloping land conservation program I just mentioned, it'd be difficult to randomize ex ante. And there are some goods such as GM food products or biofortified foods which are not yet released in the market. They cannot be, their evaluation or their demand cannot be estimated using randomized experiments. Therefore, this method is useful in order to understand the demand or acceptance or the preferences for goods that are not yet in the market or not likely to be in the market in the near future. So here are our colleagues again to talk about why they chose to use this method to study their particular case study.
Banana is one of the staple crops in Uganda. However, the increase in production has not been kept with increasing demand. Banana yields are severely reduced by several pests and diseases such as Practitioner, banana bacteria weevils, and many others. As a result, the government of Uganda initiated a genetic engineering breeding program addressing the most local banana diseases. This is aimed at producing a genetically modified banana for subsistence-oriented farmers in areas greatly affected by biotic constraints. The objective of this study was to understand Ugandan consumers' acceptance of and willingness to pay for a GM banana that is resistant to banana diseases.
Now, I decided to investigate this problem with choice experiment as I had done for two main reasons. Firstly, because I need to understand the public preferences for solid waste management scenarios which has not yet happened or which are not likely to happen in the near future. So I couldn't rely on the existing or the forthcoming data. Secondly, because as we know that there are several components of this public service that need to be improved, such as this frequency of the collection, the status of the infrastructure of these garbage bins and this collection trucks. So this choice experiment technique allowed me to estimate the public valuation of these components, and it was more feasible to know how the public rate each of these components. Now, from this ranking and trade-offs across the component, it is very much necessary for poor municipalities located in the West Bengal who are operating under tight budget constraints.
The second question I'm going to answer is, why did we choose choice modeling? As you know, choice modeling is one of the stated preference techniques that can help us to see the willingness to pay for wetland improvement, or in other words, to see the benefits of wetland improvement. And the advantage of choice modeling over other stated preference techniques, such as the contingent valuation method, is that choice modeling can help us to know not only the willingness to pay for the whole change scenario, change from status quo to the improvement status, but also help us to understand the value of each attribute in the management strategy, each attribute of the wetlands.
The choice experiment method was chosen because it allowed us to express coastal water quality in a number of ways that respondents could relate to, such as the chance of an air infection or the clarity of the water. The choice experiment method was also chosen here because we're able to present the same attributes to different subsamples and compare the estimates in slightly different contexts.
Finally, having studied choice experiment applications in developing countries in the last few years, we have a few tips or guidelines to those of you who might be interested in applying this method in developing country context. The first one is related to survey design. As in any other survey, background studies, especially focus group discussions, are very important in the design of choice experiments. In the choice experiment context especially, one needs to determine the attributes and levels of these attributes that should be used in the choice experiment. So it's important to include those attributes that matter to the end users, as well as including those attributes, the levels of the attributes that the policy is going to be changing. So it's necessary to do the focus group discussions with the target population, the target respondents, as well as focus group discussions with experts who might be designing a product, for example, a new breed of cattle, or policymakers who are designing a new policy, for example, sloping land conservation program. Second point relates to the payment vehicle. That is the mechanism through which the hypothetical payment, that's the willingness to pay, is captured. The choice of reliable and realistic payment vehicles might be fewer in developing country context. In developed countries, for example, utility bills are often used, but in developing countries, utilities may not be available, or even if available, the bills might not be collected regularly. Secondly, taxes are often used in developed countries, but in developing countries, the taxes might not be collected again, or the respondents might not be paying taxes. And even if taxes are used, it is likely that the respondents might not think of the authorities who are collecting the taxes to be credible or capable in providing the service or the good that the choice experiment is valuing. Therefore, again, focus group discussions and studies, background studies, are very important in order to select a payment vehicle that is realistic and reliable, and also to choose an authority that's going to be providing, that's a trustworthy authority that will be providing the good or the service. The third point is about experimental design. This is putting together the attributes and levels in choice sets before presenting to the respondents. There are several and an increasing number of experimental design methods in the literature, and for a beginner choice experiment practitioner, they might be difficult to follow or to replicate. Therefore, simple guidelines from the experts in the choice experiment literature are useful, as well as direct support from the experts who've been using this method for a while are useful to help budding choice experiment practitioners. Fourthly, visual aids, that is simple pictures or illustrations, are very important in developing country context, because such visual aids can circumvent illiterate respondents, problems that might arise from having illiterate respondents or respondents with minimum education, or also changes in language or terminology within the population. So, and as well as the problems that might be arising from interviewer bias. Fifthly, the respondents are an important component of collecting reliable choice experiment data. It is likely that compared to their developed country counterparts, some of the developing country respondents might not have much experience making choices or answering surveys such as choice experiments. Therefore, some hand-holding from the enumerators are very necessary. Another issue is that when they give their opinion, quite a few of the developing country respondents might expect an action or might expect an outcome in return, an outcome such as a provision of a service or provision of a good in return. And the final problem that might arise in developing country context is respondents might not think that their answers will be treated anonymously, and therefore they might not be revealing their true preferences. However, we found from our studies that all of these risks may be minimized if the instruments are designed properly and if the enumerators are trained thoroughly and they have a full understanding of the cultural and the traditional context in which the choice experiment is being implemented. Finally, it's possible that the respondents might be making random choices. Again, this might be minimized with thorough enumerator training. And to minimize this during the data collection process, we recommend simple designs with fewer attributes and fewer attribute levels. And to control for it when you're analyzing the data, we recommend including controls in the survey instrument to understand why people made the choices they made and how they made their choices. So here are our colleagues one final time to tell you about some of the challenges they faced when they implemented this method and some advice for you.
Undertaking this study was constrained with a number of challenges. One, designing choice sets was a challenging process, especially for me, who was still less experienced. Most of the respondents were not aware of biotechnology and biosafety in general, and genetic modification technology in particular. Explaining the choice experiment procedure to respondents was also not an easy task. We were able to solve these constraints or challenges by using literature to understand statistical properties of the experimental design. You understand respondents' abilities to answer the choice experiment scenarios, providing additional information before the implementation of the survey, using illustrated and laminated visual aids for each choice set, simplify the choice exercise, and limiting number of respondents per day.
Now, the main challenges that I faced during the implementation of this study is the public's apathy for answering survey-based questionnaires, especially in regard to topics like the public or environmental issues such as waste management. The public generally feels that this is the responsibility of the local governments. So this was resolved by explaining to them the threats that arise from this waste management, and in this regard the local government is not sufficient to give them more, as there is lack of financial constraints and there is a need to pay higher taxes for their improvements. Now, there was also the issue of not trusting the local governments to use the increased municipal taxes for this purpose. So, therefore, the use of municipal taxes as the payment vehicle posed some issues and protests despite the suitability and realism of this vehicle for the purpose of this study. So, for colleagues who want to apply choice experiment technique in case of India, I can suggest something. Firstly, I suggest that prior to conduct a choice experiment management survey, the enumerators should be properly trained in administering just such type of survey. Although it is simple to administer, the enumerators should be trained to talk to the respondents so that they can explain to them the different options and the levels, and to make sure that the respondents who are generally illiterate, they can understand their options before clearly making their choice. Secondly, where possible, visual aids and the use of local language is very much necessary.
Some lessons. The first one is the role of focus groups. Focus group play a very important role in defining relevant attributes, relevant questionnaire, and the problems we may face in the choice modeling exercise. And another important point in designing the questionnaire is that the wording used in the questionnaire should be simple, and the respondents should be familiar with those words. For example, we found that in Vietnam, people are not familiar with the term referendum because we have never had the referendum for 60 years. So instead of using referendum mechanism in the questionnaire, we should explain to respondents how the voting system will work. Now, the last issue that we found is the mode of the survey. We found that the personal interview survey mode is more suitable than other surveys.
Another challenge within the developing country context was that more time was needed to explain to respondents how to think about the different trade-offs and the attributes. 2 recommendations I would give when conducting choice experiments in developing countries are: firstly, try to use worked examples as far as possible, and secondly, administer the choice experiments using face-to-face interviews.
Before giving the floor to Derek, I would like to conclude my presentation by noting that developing country decision makers need information on the economic costs and benefits of various interventions so that they can design or choose welfare-enhancing policies or programs. The choice experiment method can generate such information and hence we think has a great potential to be included in the toolkit of developing country researchers or researchers working in developing countries. Okay, thank you.